Hey, this is going to be part 13 of StarCraft 2 History, and this one is going to be about the Broodlord Infestor era. Oh, fucking God. Okay, listen. I like to think of myself as perhaps not the most hardworking person you've ever met, but somebody who does his work. Somebody who puts his nose to the grindstone. Somebody who has willing to put in the long hours of research, of writing, of thinking, of reviewing all that shit. I'm willing to do all that shit. And you know what? I did write like ears for free, have done all this stuff for free, but there's a certain extent I'm unwilling to go to, and this video is probably one of them. Listen, it's not like all of Broodlord Infestor was bad, but it was fucking terrible. So I'm not gonna be the guy who's gonna like review those VODs and talk to you about all the different runs and all those different tournaments. I'm just gonna say what everybody. I'm just gonna say what everybody should probably say. It was a terrible time. Zerg had taken over. Stefano and his mad genius had taken two buffs to the Zerg race and had created a monstrosity. The first buff was the 5 range queen, which he was able to parlay that into his 3 hatch build into the Roach Max. The second buff was the Infestor buff, which he parlayed that into like the 3 hatch Infestor, and then there's like various combinations off of that. Like the Roach Infestor was a fairly common one, but so was Ling Infestor. And then eventually this all led to Infestor or Infestor Broodlord. And so Stefano was the creator, and in many ways he opened Pandora's box, and we have never recovered since. And soon after Stefano came into the fold, there came a map called Antigua Shipyards, which was easy 3 base map for StarCraft 2, but it was very hard to get to 4th. And because it was very hard to get to 4th, every Zerg player in Korea thought to themselves, man, I can't handle this 4th shit. Maybe I should try some of that European Zerg shit. And then they looked over and saw, wow, this Stefano guy, he's really kicking ass. And then they're like, oh, let's take this. Oh my fucking God, this build is fucking amazing. Let's do this on every map. And that was the TLDR of how the Broodlord Infestor era was created. And oh God, it hurts. But basically, a bunch of Zergs are going to rise up in this period. Too many to name. So in fact, I am actually only going to name the biggest ones from both the Foreigner era and from the Foreign region and the Korean region. So here we go. From the Foreigners, Stefano, big name. Even though he makes a majority of his achievements during the Broodlord Infestor era, and because he was also the one who incidentally, in my opinion, created this fucking era, you know what? He's still, in my book, probably the best foreigner to have ever played the game. Despite whatever imbalance you might want to call into question, he at least he will always have the case for it because there was a lot of different aspects about his game that was good beyond just him shifting the meta, creating the paradigm. He was very meticulous about his builds and refining them. He was obviously very forward thinking because he realized how strong the Infestor was, but not only that, he realized how strong the Queen was as a defensive unit as time went on, and with the 5 range Queen, he could stabilize a 3 base hatch economy with no problem. So stuff. And I think when we talk about Stefano, I think his most underrated aspect was his patience. And this is a guy who literally was willing to play 2.5 hours to win a ZVZ Swarm Host versus Swarm Host war just so he could win. And that's like a famous quote, like I can't find anymore, but basically he said the difference between him and other top foreigners was that he was more willing to win. And the reason he believed he was more willing to win was because he was more patient. Like, eventually, every other foreigner would get tired of that bullshit and just attack. Just like, fuck it, whatever. And you know what? Plenty of Koreans would have done the same, but not Stefano. Stefano would wait for fucking forever. This is a guy like in a real in a, like a here's an analogy basically. If if any other player gets caught in a bear trap, they'll start screaming in pain and try to rip the bear trap off. Like Stefano is a guy who like calmly looks at his foot, calmly analyzes the situation, calmly realizes, oh, somebody's trying to kill me. Then he will cut off his foot and find another way towards the path of survival. Like that's kind of Stefano's other great aspect was he he was very good at evaluating dead situations. So he would never or he very rarely put extra resources into saving a dead position on the map. And that's what actually made him a tactical, in my opinion, a very tactical mind. And it's also why he has such a great rivalry with Polt. It wasn't just because Polt was one of the few players who could play against Bruno Infestor. It was also because the two of them thought about the game, especially the late game, in a very similar fashion, where like where they would analyze and critique the strategic and tactical positions they had, and then they would make the decision on what they wanted to do. And Polt was more aggressive, Stefano was more passive, but it created a lot of very great games between the two of them because sometimes they'd force each other into different positions, different types of positions. So, very those are some of the better games to watch from this Bruno Infestor era if you actually plan to watch them. But yeah, that's for me what Stefano was the best at was his tactical thinking, his meticulousness, and his this is a strange thing to add, but also his incredible composure. I feel like he was one of the most clutch players we'd ever seen from a foreigner, and I feel like part of the reason it was because he was much more laissez-faire with his practice, at least apparently. As far as we know, like Rotterdam and Bitter used to talk about this all the time, how they roomed with this guy for a month. He didn't like practice or anything. Went to WCS won it. Like that was just kind of how Stefano rolled. And you know what? Even though in this era he wasn't necessarily like hardest working, he did build up a lot of work in 2011 and in Warcraft 3 as far as I've investigated or I've looked into, because apparently he was like a grinding machine at that point. And even in his retirement, he still enjoyed playing in the ladder, even though obviously he wasn't like taking it seriously. So yeah, definitely like. Well, I think the lazy genius bit was a bit overblown. There was definitely a part of it where like it did help in the fact that he seemed to not crumble under pressure because in a strange kind of weird correlation, the more you practice for an event, the more pressure you feel towards that event. And since Stefano didn't necessarily practice as much as his competitors, as far as we know, maybe that helped him mentally prepare for these events in a better way. Because no matter what shit went down with Stefano, like he could be partying till like 5 a.m. or whatever the fuck it was. He would show up next day, play his games, be completely fine. He could lose his luggage, he could lose his keyboard, he could lose his mouse, borrow somebody else's keyboard and mouse, play, still win the tournament. Like that was just who Stefano was. An incredible player and incredible mind for the game, and I still think he plays to this day, even though he's not nearly as competitive. And I'm still unsure of how seriously he practices the game, because it's not just the amount of ladder games you play, it's like how you're thinking about the games. Like as his famous rival Polt once said, it's better to lose 9 out of 10 games if you're learning way more from those 9 out of 10 games than winning 9 out of 10 ladder games. That's how Polt thought about practice anyway. And there's four other Zerg players we've got a note here. Vortex, a guy misaligned as a patch Zerg. He wasn't really. He was good during the Brutal Infestor era. He was also good in 2013. And just a generally solid Protoss, Vortex. The other guy you got to look out for is Nurchio. This was a player that people had hyped up a long time online before 2012 as a very great player. He really found his stride during the Brutal Infestor era, and then kind of tapered off. He really disliked Heart of the Swarm, and I think there's a very good reasons as to why he would. And it's not just because the Infestor is gone. It's because the way Heart of the Swarm works out, there's no real good tier 2.5 unit for the Zerg race after the Infestor gets nerfed. And Nurgio was definitely a guy who liked to play late game. And so there's no really great way to transition without doing a lot of damage or without like getting some kind of advantage in the early game and without having like some, or in Sue's case, not having some kind of godlike mechanics. At least that's how I read. That's how I read into his game, but I haven't researched it enough to know for sure. Uh, Scarlet was another one. This is the time she came up into power. I forget which IPL it was, but in one of them, basically she forgot to build in her first game ever. She forgot to build a spawning pool. Asked the Muslim for a regame after she lost. And the Muslim was like, "Sure, let's regame." And the Muslim made the greatest mistake of his life because he basically needed to get as many wins as he could. Looking back on his career, and that was definitely one he could not chop. But in any case, Scarlet would rise up and during the Patch Zerg era, and was pretty good. I actually think she underperformed, all things considered, just how good she was during how good she could be, at least during the Patch Zerg era, and her subsequent triumphs generally come from. I'd personally say, kind of like innovation, like from metas where Zerg was a bit too strong or a bit overpowered, or maybe not too strong, but like overpowered, or like it was Zerg favored, even to the modern day. I think that's the case, but there is a difference between her before Legacy of the Void and her after, in the sense that her before Legacy of the Void, she played more along the theory of Idra, play to the late game, play with more skill, play correctly. And then as time went on, she basically became more like Hitman. And that's a reference, I suppose. But basically, I think she went along the lines of a very similar evolution of Hot as Rain, where, yeah, you can play the late game, but should you always play the late game? And that is something that kind of messed up Rain in the earlier parts of his career. And if he had that mentality, if he had learned that, he probably have a few more titles under his belt. And the final foreigner we have to talk about is Snoot. Snoot comes on at the very end of Wings of Liberty. This is a guy who had some. He's a very interesting character to talk about. I think Thorne basically did the best article anybody's ever done on Snoot. You should look it up. Somewhere. Basically, the entire Wikipedia page is like a kind of like a weird copy paste of the Thorne article, but there's a lot more to it. But basically, Snoot is a guy who has that Korean mentality of grind, grind, grind. And there's a point where he actually figured out, he actually heard some kind of rumor or something that if you practice 12 hours a day, you could become as good as anybody. Apparently, that was like a theory in Korea. So he started doing that, and then he started realizing after like months into it, like it was way too much. I was like, he was burning his brains out. He was dreaming of StarCraft in like a bad sense. So he had to tone it down a bit. But this is definitely a guy who was incredibly hardworking, and very similar to Rain in terms of theory crafting. And I'll get back to him later when he really comes into power. But basically, this is the first time you really see him, and nobody really knew what he would become eventually. Because in my opinion, I think he, in terms of pure skill, pure theoretical skill, abandoning all signs of patches, all signs of all ideas about pressure, all ideas about achievements and results. I think in pure skill, I personally believe Snoot probably reached the highest level anybody ever did for a foreigner. Just my opinion, but he basically, in my opinion, had the highest peak of any foreigner we've ever seen, and I'll contest that with anybody. So that finishes up the foreigner side, and you can look up the results yourself. I don't want to go through all of them, but basically, Stefano wins like NASL. He wins WCS EU. He's a threat to everybody. Scarlet, I think she won WCS NA that year. Nurgio, I'm almost certain he won Bucharest. Yeah, Bucharest. Vortex, he probably could have won WCS EU from Stefano, but wasn't meant to be that time. Stefano's a bit too clutch, so to speak. Snoot wins, I believe, a Home Story Cup at the very end of 2012. And I'm sure they have plenty of other achievements. Those are just the ones I remember. And then we're going to go to the Korean side. And the Korean side is a bit more interesting. So, Lenok is a guy I talked about earlier. Like, I basically named video after him. It was like the Jokji Lenok jump because this guy was so good. Like, he basically leapt up in skill. And then he kind of has a small downfall in the early parts of StarCraft 2, 2012. But then immediately comes back up once, like, the Brutal Infestor really kicks in. Because Lenok kind of realizes he's allowed to be as fucking crazy as he wants, so long as he transitions into an Infestor later. And that's basically what he does for the entirety of 2012. Is like he'd be the guy doing like double spire muta plays. He'd be the guy doing like crazy roach layer queen spine caller like rushes. He was the guy I stole drone drill Zergling all in from, like a 3-base drone drill Zergling all in. Like basically he had like the most builds of anybody, the most cheese builds of any Zerg player I'd seen at that point. But he could always transition to a middle game or late game, and he was also probably the second or third guy to build like 80 infestors or some bullshit like that. Like this guy abused the shit out of infestors more than anybody I'd seen in my life. And in 2012, that was the peak of his prime. He was a guy who actually like fought Life head to head, and in my opinion, actually had very good chances to beat Life multiple times. So a very great player overall, and you have to give him, no matter what you think about this era and its shit imbalance, you have to give him IPL 5, because IPL 5 is the most ridiculous tournament ever hosted in StarCraft 2 history. It's, in my opinion, the hardest tournament that's ever been played. Let me check. Yeah, I think it was 72 players seeded into a 64-player double elim. He won it all, and all 72 players were basically like almost all of them were like from rank 1 through 70, like 1 through 80 or something. Like nobody was fucking missing in this tournament. He beat them all. In a sense, you could probably say it's harder than GSL in a certain sense, because of there's no time to prepare. You're running. You have to play against everybody, and then this, along with his MLG Providence run and his GSL semifinals, is one of the reasons why he actually made it on my list, because he was so dominant from the end of 2011 to 2012, and he was such an incredible player that if Life didn't go fucking crazy at the end of 2012, he'd have easily been the best Zerg player of the year, and arguably in contention for player of the year. And then we'll talk a little about Life. He'll actually have his own video, but basically Life is another player who actually abused the Brutal Infestor. Well, everybody did, but he was also a player who tactically changed the entire way the game is played, from a Zerg perspective, especially in regards to aggression and counter-aggression, and not controlling, but understanding the screens of the opponent, as in where they are looking at any particular time, because he consistently was able to get his units into a good counterattack, because he understood like the rhythmic patterns of his opponent to a certain extent. And this is just theorycraft on my part, because I had played so much StarCraft 2, so I kind of understood how a lot of players were thinking or shifting between the screens. But basically, that is Life, found a way to counterattack at the exact moments where your attention was elsewhere on the map, doing something else. An incredible player, and for obvious reasons, not a patch Zerg. I will say Lenok is definitely a patch Zerg. I'll get into that in another video, though. Symbol. This is a guy who started off trying not to be a patch Zerg, but he felt a soul-crushing defeat from Seed, realized the error of his ways, embraced the patch Zerg, and then ran off to become one of the better Zerg players of 2012, and then ending Wings of Liberty in a GSL finals where he lost to Ro. And Symbol was a smart player. He basically was the first one to understand that Marine King was very exploitable, and Marine King never survived it. almost never like Marine King basically got killed by Symbol. In a sense, Symbol went on to be a very very great player, one of the best patch Zerg players we'd seen, and even in 2013, after like the induction of Kespa, he was still one of the best Zerg players, which should show how good he actually was. Because by that point, the player pool in Korea will have effectively doubled, despite like a bunch of players leaving to play in WCS for NA and EU. Symbol was still a very strong player, and he actually changes his style a lot from Wings of Liberty to Heart of the Swarm as his skill starts to fade away. The next guy we'll talk about is Violet. Definitely a patch Zerg to the bone. I think I mentioned this in the podcast about Hero. Violet was a guy who had a lot of aggression, but he could macro behind it. But the difference between macroing behind it in Heart of the Swarm and Legacy of the Void, and macroing behind it in Wings of Liberty, is that in Wings of Liberty, you weren't actually behind if you did this aggression and it didn't work, because there's this unit called the Infestor, and the Infestor could make any comeback possible. If you don't believe me, watch Yu-Gi-Oh! Versus Parting, where I think it's on Ohana. Ohana means family, and god damn it, and basically Parting has like double the supply and against Yu-Gi-Oh, but Yu-Gi-Oh just keeps massing Infestors on 2 base and eventually wins. And that's basically all you need to know. You get enough Infestors, you can beat anything. Let's see here. Hyun was an interesting character. He goes along the similar lines as Symbol, but in my opinion, not quite as successful. Both of them were from TSL, actually, so I guess there's a little line between the two. Hyun was a player from Brood War. Like, I'm not actually sure how great he was, cause I imagine he wasn't that great because I haven't heard of him, and I watched a bunch of the Brood War. Like, he was, as far as I remember, he was like a decent pro league player. But as for being among the best Zerg players, I don't think so, because I watched a bunch of the Brood War VODs of the best players I'd seen in individual tournaments, and he'd very rarely appear, if any at all. Like, I'm drawing a blank here, so if somebody wants to correct me, they can. But Hyun is in StarCraft 2. He was interesting because he played a similar style to Symbol, except way more on the aggressive end, and he had this very, very crazy run when IPL was still sponsoring esports things. Basically, they had this online show match where you would play a best of 9 against everybody, and then Hyun had some stupid, crazy record. Let me see if it's on here. Yeah, where he basically won 14 consecutive best of 9s, and this is a guy who basically killed it online, and he was pretty good offline too. So, yeah, I think in the grand scheme of things, he wasn't as great as we thought he'd be because he was so crazy online. But yeah, definitely a patch Zerg you have to know, because he's going to do a lot. He does a lot of great things, at least a lot of great achievements. I don't know about great things in 2012, and is a pretty good Zerg player throughout 2013 as well, even though he drops off. The next player to talk about is Curious, I suppose. Don't want to talk about Curious, though. Probably not. Basically, Curious... I guess I'll go out with this. Curious was the guy to eventually solve Parting's Soul Train, but it came at the very end of Wings of Liberty. And Curious was a guy who played a lot of StarCraft, and you can kind of tell with the way he played, because he could play every build effectively, and he could play every style effectively, but he was never a master of any single one of them. So it was very rare to see Curious make a deep run at any point in StarCraft 2 history, even though he had some very incredible games every once in a while. Like, the most memorable, in my opinion, was his online game in IEM qualifier against Innovation, when Innovation was at the peak of his powers, in my opinion, and Curious basically out-strategizes Innovation and beats him, despite it being a Terran favored meta, despite Innovation being mechanically at its prime, and despite Curious not being as good as Innovation, Curious wins out. So yeah, it's Curious for you. And basically all of this, you have to understand all of this context to understand the second miracle of MVP. Because like I talked about earlier in a previous video, MVP had been suffering injuries. Famously, he had to get taken to the hospital at like Home Story Cup, and like that's where a bunch of the shit gets shown. But in 2012 at IEM Cologne, it's a tournament with it's a pretty decent tournament, not with all the best Koreans or all the best foreigners necessarily, but it was a pretty strong mix overall. Talk about MC, Oz, JYP, Naniwa, Bomber, 4GG, Lucifron. Lucifron was a bit hyped. I don't know if he was as good as people said he was back then. I'd say this was his best of his career, actually. So fair enough. I'll put it on Lucifron and Nesty. And the reason this is like one of those rare tournaments where I think it's underrated, because I personally am of the opinion that in the Broodlord Infestor era, I think any Zerg from that era could be any other player in any other era, assuming the patch was that patch and the player they were playing is not another Zerg. And the reason I say that is because it was so imbalanced, and it was that's kind of fucked up. But the foreigner players definitely understood it on a very high level, and so that's why Wings of Liberty ends in so many Zerg versus Zerg like battles, basically. And the reason I consider this one underrated is because basically MVP takes a build that nobody had seen for a long time and revamps it and then changes it to make it altogether something else. And the build I'm talking about is the Hellion Banshee. This first appears on the scene. Depends on if you want to look at it from a TVT or a 2VZ perspective. As far as I know, Clyde tried to use this in TVT very early in might have been the GSL Opens, like maybe GSL Open 2 or something. And it's never seen again because, as it turns out, like if you just get a Viking, it kills both. And Clyde didn't think of this. But Top uses this again against Nesty in the GSL Super Tournament. And it's an incredible build because basically with one base Hellion Banshee, you're gonna harass the shit out of the Zerg player, and this left Top in situations where he was like 100 supply ahead. Still somehow managed to lose one of the games, but that's Top for you. And this basically goes out of style once two base Muta comes into the play, because two base Muta kind of countered it to a certain extent, not as good as people hope, but it was actually no. This came to play to stop two base Muta. My mistake, because the timing of it was such that two base Muta would get severely damaged if you cut too many corners. But in order to beat this build that Top was coming out with, more roach play, more Zergling play, and eventually just straight up Queens would stop it, because Queens would get buffed by the end of 2011 with the 5 range buff. And so MVP takes this old build that had kind of existed and then retools it to make it a 2-base build. So you go on 2 bases, you get Hellion Banshee, and he there's like this OGN caster, I forgot his name now, but he was like the analyst for the desk, and he basically said something that I agree with. He says there's only 2 types of mech play in Wings of Liberty. There is either the tank or the Thor, and with a tank, Mutas kill that. With a Thor, roaches kill that. And so any Zerg that can scout can instantly counter whatever the fuck the mech player is doing. And so what MVP does is fucking genius, because what MVP does is he kind of solves the answer that nobody else could solve, and plenty of and And in my opinion, we've never seen another answer like this against such an imbalanced meta, basically, where he kind of changes the entire it kind of changes the entire idea of what mech can be and how it should be in a sense. So basically, what MVP does is he masses Hellions, smashes, and then can get Banshees with cloak or without cloak, and he also has like a variant with Blue Flame Hellion, and that he kind of uses that against life. And basically, what it does is like he uses these two units to like harass and control the Zerg player, and because Mutalisks are no longer interesting as like an opening tool. People would rather get roaches, people would rather get lings, rather get queens to get that 3-base economy going, rolling really fast. And so because MVP can do this, MVP is constantly putting pressure on the Zerg opponent without committing. But because they're such highly mobile units, they can get away without dying. And this allows him to get to 3 bases very fast and critically get to double upgrades. And then with double upgrades, if the Zerg player goes land heavy with the roaches and infestors, he can go tanks. But if he sees a very quick shift towards a faster shift towards infestor broodlord, MVP can just mass Thors to give him like a stopgap while he goes and this will give him enough time to get the Vikings out and maybe the Ravens. Sometimes he did that if he could, but it was a very hard thing to do. And so this was a genius move because it basically solved a gigantic paradox in a gigantic problem in the TVZ meta at the time, and from then on forth, basically. And that's why I gave MVP so much credit for using this build. And it was a build he had created because his wrists were dying, basically. So it was much less stressful on his his body, and he ends up like shocking the Zerg players of the world, and then he goes back and uses it against a bunch of the Zerg players in Korea and wins for a time before they get used to it. Even then, despite like Zerg being overwhelmingly favored, this gave Mech a chance to survive if he didn't have like godly mechanics as a bio player. And among like the godly mechanical bio players, the only one that's ever, in my opinion, done, and the only 2 players that have done anything against Brutal Infestor using the bio style is Tasia and Innovation. Innovation very briefly though, didn't last very long because he wasn't in. He didn't rise up to power until like 2013. And I guess if you want, you can include Bomber in that scenario, but Bomber was like a very strange sort of player, and Pult could play against Brutal Infestor, but it was much more of a tactical style where he was trying to get 360-degree surrounds on the other army, and that, while it's awesome, that wasn't something you could do consistently. So that kind of covers MVP's second miracle, and a very underrated, in my opinion, tournament, very underrated achievement, because I don't think any Terran player, from what I've seen from the rest of StarCraft 2 history, if you put them in MVP situation, I don't think they could come up with the build MVP did. That's my opinion. So that covers it for Brutal Infestor. Oh, thank God it's over. See you later.